We're starting today a series reading Paul's letter to the Romans. So I'm aiming to do two things in what I say today. First of all, in the first half of what I say, I'll give you a big picture overview of the whole letter. Why is Paul writing this letter? How has Paul organised this letter? What's he focusing on? Because this is quite a long letter. And then in the second part, I'm going to dig into the first part of Romans, chapter 1, verses 1 to 17, which we had read. And they set the scene for the whole letter, a bit like the overture at the beginning of an opera that plays over the main themes of a long piece of music. So first of all, let's ask, why is Paul writing Romans? In our reading, we learned several things about this. We learned in verse 10 that Paul has never visited the church in Rome. He really wants to visit because he's heard about their faith, verses 8 to 10, and he really wants to visit them, and he's wanted to do it again and again. Now that's really interesting because he greets 26 different individuals in Romans chapter 16 in the greetings at the end of the letter. So while Paul's never visited, he does know Christian people in Rome. And he says to them, I want to come to you in order to bring some spiritual gift to you, verses 11 and 12. I want to bring you encouragement in your faith. I want to help to encourage you. So at one level, Romans is a letter preparing for Paul's visit to Rome, to a church that he doesn't know in person because he's never been there before. Now if we jump to the other end of the letter, to chapter 15, in what's the kind of wrapping up part of the letter, Paul explains a bit more about why he wants to visit Rome. He says in verses 16 to 19 that he's travelled widely in proclaiming the gospel of Jesus. He says in verse 16 that he's a minister of Christ Jesus to the Gentiles. That is, people who are not Jewish. And he pictures himself in verse 19, he says, from Jerusalem and as far around as Illyricum, I fully proclaim the good news of Jesus. Illyricum is on the northwest coast of what we call Greece. So picture a big arc sweeping from Jerusalem in the land of Israel through Turkey and right into and right across to the far side of Greece. I've covered that ground, says Paul, and I've planted churches in many cities. I fully proclaim the good news of Christ. So now he says, in verses 23 and 24, with no further place for me in these regions, I desire to come to you when I go to Spain. Paul desires to take the gospel of Jesus to new places. He says in verse 20, I make it my ambition to proclaim the good news, not where Christ has already been named. He wants to go to places where they've never heard of Jesus and tell them the good news about Jesus. So he wants to go to Rome en route to Spain. And he's preparing now to go to Jerusalem before he heads for Rome. In verse 25, at present, I'm going to Jerusalem in a ministry to the saints, for Macedonia and Achaia have been pleased to share their resources with the poor among the saints at Jerusalem. Paul is taking a collection of money from his Greek and Turkish churches to the believers in Jerusalem who are struggling financially. So that's the plan. Paul's wanting to visit Rome and he's never been there before. Paul's looking for new territory to take the gospel message. And so he wants to visit them in Rome en route to going further west to Spain. He's writing from Corinth in Greece, in the south of Greece. His postwoman is Phoebe in chapter 16 verse 1, and he introduces Phoebe as his letter bearer, and he says she's a deacon from the church in Kenshray. Kenshray's the port of Corinth. So Paul's almost certainly in Corinth when he's writing. And given that he's writing shortly before his final trip to Jerusalem, the book of Acts helps us know where that's located. So in Acts chapter 20, when Luke says that Paul is in Greece, he means he's in Corinth or somewhere nearby. And interestingly, in Romans 16:23, Paul passes on greetings from Gaius and Erastus, who we know from Acts and the Corinthian letters were significant Christian people in Corinth. And in Romans 16:21, Paul sends greetings from Timothy, Lucius, Jason, and Sosipater. And in Acts 20 verse 4, they are part of the group that's about to travel to Jerusalem with Paul, taking the collection. So these things mesh together. So Paul's writing from Corinth. So his key reasons for writing are that he intends to go on to Spain because he feels he's completed his work in the Eastern Mediterranean. So he's looking to Rome to be a kind of home base for his Western Mediterranean work, because he's going to travel up through Italy and through southern France and then across to Spain. Syria and Antioch had been the base for his work in the Eastern Mediterranean, and he's hoping that Rome will be. Paul's method, as we heard in chapter 1 verse 16, is he goes to the Jew first and then to the Greek. And that's his method throughout the book of Acts. He goes first in a new city to the Jewish synagogue and speaks about Jesus there. Then when he gets thrown out of the synagogue, he goes and speaks to people who are Gentiles, who are not Jewish. But the trouble is that might be an unattractive proposition for the church in Rome. Let me explain why. Do you remember last year when we read Galatians, that Paul was fighting a battle for Jewish Christians to accept and welcome Gentile Christians without them being expected to keep the Jewish law and for the men to be circumcised? Well, in Romans, Paul is writing just about the reverse battle. The Roman Christians who are predominantly Gentile are in danger of looking down on Jewish people and not really seeing the point of a Jewish mission, because God's written the Jews off. Jerusalem's going to be destroyed, as Jesus had warned. And in the city of Rome, in the population in general, there's a long tradition of anti-Semitism. As in the Roman world as a whole, Jews were seen as really weird people. And some Jews who did well in business or government led to people resenting them and being anti-Semitic. In AD 49, the Emperor Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome because of riots. The Roman historian Suetonius tells us that they were riots because of Christus, which sounds like a misspelling of Christus, Christ. And it looks like there were riots in the Jewish quarter of Rome because some had become believers in Jesus and others hadn't. And we know that some of these people finished up elsewhere. Paul met Aquila and Priscilla, his wife, in Corinth in Acts 18, and they'd recently come from Rome after the expulsion under Claudius, says Luke. Now, it's unlikely that all the Jews were expelled from Rome. There were probably some 30,000 Jewish people in Rome around this time, but it could well be that key leaders were thrown out. And the effect of that on the Roman churches was that they would lose much of their leadership, because it would be natural for Jewish believers to rise to leadership. They were the ones who knew the scriptures, the Old Testament. They were the ones who would understand what it meant for Jesus to be Messiah and King of the world. They'd understand about the God of Israel. so they would naturally become leaders. But when these people were kicked out of Rome by the emperor, then that could well lead to the Roman churches becoming dominated by Gentile believers, people who had no Jewish and no scriptural heritage. So Claudius did that in AD 49. But when Claudius died in AD 54, a new emperor came to rule, Nero. And Nero repealed Claudius's laws when he took the role of emperor. Paul's writing Romans in the time of Nero in somewhere around AD 55 to 57. So by this time, Jewish people are drifting back to Rome because Claudius's edict has been done away with. And that, of course, includes Jewish Christians. This Gentile church now had Jewish believers back. But there could be a danger in assuming that, okay, these Jewish believers are back, but they can eat and live separately from us Gentile believers because they caused all that trouble a few years ago, and we really don't have a desire to do much with them. And there are a few hints in the letter at tensions between Gentile and Jewish believers. Romans chapters 9 to 11 are full of the question of what God's doing with the Jewish people now, since so many reject Jesus as their Messiah. Romans 14 has lots of teaching about handling differences over what to eat. Remember, Jews have special food. Or whether you celebrate special days, the Jewish festivals. And Romans 15:7 makes this strong statement, welcome one another just as Christ has welcomed you for the glory of God. So Paul's addressing that issue and wanting to show Jewish and Gentile believers that they belong together in Jesus Christ. And this is the church that Paul wants as his base for his missionary work in the Western Mediterranean. So he's got to persuade these Gentile Christians who are a bit suspicious of Jews that his policy of going to the Jew first and then also to the Greek is okay. So Romans is Paul's exposition of God's faithfulness to his covenant with his people in order to persuade this church in Rome to play its part in the mission and unity of the church. We might call it Paul's missionary manifesto. So in 1524, Paul says that I hope to see you on my journey and to be sent on by you once I've enjoyed your company for a while. To be sent on is a polite way of saying with some financial assistance, please. And similarly, in 1528, Paul says, when I've completed this and delivered to them what's been collected, I will set out by way of you to Spain. That's a similar phrase, which is very politely saying, I really need your support for this mission to the Western Mediterranean. So think of Romans as Paul's missionary manifesto and ask, what's the gospel message that Paul's explaining here? What's his good news? Because that's our good news today. And then what's Paul's strategy in communicating that good news? How does he go about it? What can we learn for our time and place from his approach to his place and time?